All right. Good evening, everybody. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you to everybody for coming to our last BYOBB workshop in this cycle. Great to see some folks that have been to some of these before. Also great to see some folks who have not been here before. So for those of you that have not, and those of you that are watching on YouTube, all of our workshops are recorded and put on YouTube. So you're welcome to go back and view them whenever you'd like. They're a great resource as you are crafting your submission, thinking about all that. As I'd like to do to start every one of these, I will just go over kind of very briefly the resources and things available to you for the BYOBB, and then go over a quick timeline of what we have coming up, and then talk a little bit about what we're going to do tonight, specifically around the requirements for the pitch deck that you need to submit as part of your BYOBB submission. So, and then I will turn it over to our awesome featured speaker who's going to talk you through from an expert standpoint and somebody who was just traveling last week and did this and has probably done it dozens and dozens and dozens of times in the past, I don't know, 4 years. 4 days and 4 years, I guess. So, so yes, tonight's session is all about crafting your pitch. So again, this is the #1 resource that I always like to give to people. If you are not already, please become a Startup Tree member. It is very easy to do. It is very free to do. We do not spam you with invites. There is not a ton of stuff that comes flooding into your inbox from Startup Tree. The #1 resource that I think this gives you as a BYOBB hopefully submitter is that it gives you the easiest ability to save your submission and come back to it later, as opposed to having a Word document, which I also recommend you do just to kind of workshops and stuff. But becoming a member, it makes it easier for you to make your submission. It also gives you access to our mentor portal. These are folks that are have raised their hand and said, we want to help folks, particularly around crafting their BYOBB submission. We will go over in a second some kind of last minute resources that we'll be offering as the deadline approaches. But this tip #4 of reaching out to mentors is always a good one that I like to share. The second tip for getting started is actually get started. Look at the submission, look at kind of what you need to do, maybe sketch out some things that you have in mind. And you can ask any question that you have either through the portal or you can reach out to me directly. iei@temple.edu is also a great email to use because a bunch of us check that. We have put together a Google shared resources folder online that has some past submissions, that has the judging rubric, that has everything that you would need to know about crafting a great submission. So check that out. The slides from the previous workshops are on there. After Linda and I connect about getting the slides that she wants to share, those will be up on there. And so a great resource for you to go back and review the Google Resources folder. We talked about mentoring. And so here are our key dates coming up. So the submission deadline fast approaching. We are less than a month away, which is crazy. Know that for those of you that are current students, we've got spring break coming up. Not next week, but the following week. So maybe carve out some time while you are relaxing and taking a break, a much needed break from your studies to kind of finalize your submission. But if you need some extra help finalizing your submission, on March 9th and 10th, and I hope to get some information out about this next week, some kind of concrete times and locations, virtual here, all that sort of stuff. We are going to have what's called expert mentoring, and that is where we are going to ask some mentors, some advisors, some folks that have been through this before, maybe some past judges, past reviewers, to come and just be a resource for you. What this is a great time for is, hey, I'm stuck on this one little piece. I don't quite know how to share this appropriately, or I'm looking at my financial statements and I just want to make sure they make sense. Can we spend 20 minutes looking them over together and you give me some feedback? Those are some great things to do during this time. Not great things to do during this time is, hey, expert mentor, I have not started my submission at all. Can we sit down and write it together? Not a good time to do that. So these should be kind of last minute, maybe 1 or 2 questions that you've got, or again, hey, I'm stuck on this part. Can we talk about how I can maybe finalize this before it's time to hit submit? Again, if you have not started on that, the expert mentoring session is not really the time for you to utilize. So again, submissions are due at 11:59 p.m. on March 11th. We will announce the finalists 2 weeks after that, after our reviewers have gotten a chance to look at all of the submissions. For people that are named to be a finalist, April 1st through April 8th is when we will be doing mandatory pitch coaching. So please know that you do have to attend a mandatory pitch coach session so that you can in some way practice your pitch so that we have a sense of what it's like, give you some feedback and some time to kind of fine tune it before our finalist pitch event on the April 15th. Finalists are obviously expected to be there. And even if you are not a finalist, this is a great event. We try and usually get some good food. We try and usually get a great speaker. We get some great feedback, and you get to see the presentations that made it to the finalist stage of the night. So any questions about the timeline or any of the kind of last minute upcoming events before I move on to kind of talking about this evening? Okay, cool. So tonight we are talking all things pitch. Linda, again, is an expert in this, is going to kind of talk about her experience with this. I wanted to just kind of quickly go over all of this is spelled out in the submission rubric, in the eligibility requirements, all that, but just kind of go through these a little bit one by one so that you can understand what is expected. So in your submission, in your actual digital submission that you are putting through the Startup Tree profile or portal, you need to upload an investor pitch deck. We went over kind of what that is in one of our earlier workshops. I think it was the first one, so be sure to go back and check that out, kind of thinking about what is an investor pitch deck. In the notes section of each slide, please include a detailed message, maybe not word for word what you would be saying if you were up here giving this presentation, but this just helps kind of fill out what the content that is on your slide. And so I'm thinking particularly like if you have a graphic that maybe doesn't have the best kind of overall explanation, and you would say, as you can see in this graphic, starting in year one, going to year right, you want to spell that out a little bit in the notes section so that the reviewers have an opportunity to see, okay, what would the speaker be saying if they were presenting this slide in person? Again, it should ideally be the script that you were saying. Totally understand if you are not at that point, but just, again, this is your opportunity to put up a slide that you would normally talk about and then spell out kind of the things that you would be saying to help complement that slide. Please do include those notes on your slides. If you do not, again, this is an opportunity for the reviewer to maybe just make some assumptions or not get a full clear picture. So please be sure to include that so that you can get the best score possible. You do not need to follow the exact order of slides found in the guidelines that we share. You should include all of that appropriate information in there. And so I can't remember the exact order, but if for you the financial slide makes more sense or financial slides make more sense at the beginning, put them at the beginning if that helps you tell your story. If that's best for you to save until the end, save it until the end. You do need to kind of cover all of those things that are spelled out in there. And again, that's all in the submission guidelines, but be sure to do that. This last piece I really think is important. If you need 1 to 2 slides to convey specific information, that is totally fine. That's great. Please remember that as a finalist, you will be limited to 7 minutes. And then I will firmly but politely cut you off and say that's our time. So again, as you are thinking about this, right, you should not upload a slide deck that is 50 slides long, right? That's way too much information to cover in 7 minutes. I'm not going to say that it needs to be a minimum number and it can't be above a maximum number, but just know that this should be something that you could reasonably go over in about 7 minutes time. Again, we're not asking you to record yourself and have that down to the millisecond, but just please kind of think about that as you are crafting the slide decks to upload. Any questions about the requirements before I turn it over to our presenter? Okay, if you do have some and want to ask me after the fact, I am more than happy to. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Linda Alunkal, a proud Fox alum, and let her kind of go through the content that she's going to be delivering this evening. So thank you, Linda.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, and a round of applause.
Okay. Hi, guys. Can you hear me? Hi. How's everybody doing? Good. Excited for this exciting submission. I mean, BYOBB is a big deal, guys. I hope you guys know that. And the reason why it's a big deal, it's actually one of the largest pitch competitions in our nation that has one of the biggest awards. So take this process seriously. You know, lean on Neil and Alan, who have put an absorbent amount of work to really get ready for this event. And it is an event. So be excited for it, and hopefully wishing you guys the best outcome. A little bit about me. I forgot to do a cover slide, but so a little bit about me. I am a Fox alum, a proud Fox alum. 2014 is when I got my MBA. I was working full-time and doing it part-time. I'm a chemical engineer by training with the MBA, and I started off my career in oil and gas. I have 20 years in industry, 10 working at refineries, chemical plants down the street from here at Sunoco. Moved a lot of rail cars, trucks, barges around, managed derailments, managed, supply issues, and also built underground storage tanks at the Westchester Sunoco. So if you guys ever drive by that, that's my project, which was a lot of fun. But with that said, I then went to Johnson & Johnson for the next 10. And each one of these roles that I chose in corporate, I intentionally chose roles that made me really uncomfortable. And I did it on purpose because, firstly, I'm an immigrant, a minority woman. I didn't belong in a lot of the rooms that I was in, especially in oil and gas, especially doing night shifts at the Union facility there in Frankfurt, in Philly. But I always had to pull up a seat at the table. And what that taught me is I need to be very comfortable with being uncomfortable. So throughout my career, I chose, and I, in most instances, wrote my job description. But I always knew that I wanted to be an entrepreneur, which is why, and I found that out at my graduation ceremony here at Temple, where, and I can't remember the speaker, but it was one of those moments in your life where it's like core memory, right? And at graduation, this individual said, do you want to be that person that comes down the elevator with your box and your plants and your files and say, that was a great life? Or do you want to be the person that says, I did the best that I could in my career and I made the biggest impact that I possibly could have and did it for myself, I did it for my family, I did it for my purpose. And that's when I realized I need to be an entrepreneur. And at that point at J&J, I was exploring entrepreneur roles, and I intentionally chose positions that I knew was somewhat of a risk. But I also knew that if I found the heart of the company and helped create and build, and for that matter, I was pitching at Johnson & Johnson yearly to save my team, I realized that's when I can find a little bit of purpose and a little bit of, that entrepreneur and that grit and determination. So I spent a lot of time at J&J doing that. I worked within an accelerator at J&J, World Without Diseases Accelerator, where we learned to prevent, treat, and cure diseases. And in my case, it was allergic disease. With that said, unfortunately, even with that, and I knew it was an experiment. Unfortunately, in 2022, my entire group got eliminated, the accelerator organization, because the new CEO comes in, this is just how it works in corporate America. And at that point, I realized my value and what I always wanted to do was to live with purpose and to have an impact. And how else to do it if I don't do it myself? So that's when I started a company called BYOBB, and then at the same time, I met my current co-founder at BioLattice, Dr. Amelia Zolander, another minority female, 5-year Navy veteran, PhD biomedical engineer, a brilliant scientist. And she had this amazing technology. And I realized I got to do both. So BYOBB right now, is a food allergy prevention company, digital health. I pitched on this stage for BYOBB 3 times, impact, challenge, the social, I'm getting all of these wrong, I'm so sorry. And then also BYOBB. And, we placed on each one, and the practice there was incredible. But then at the same time, so what happened is BioLattice, essentially, we started working together and we started getting traction. And for today's conversation, I'm going to focus on BioLattice. And the reason I'm saying this is I've recently been appointed the CEO of BYOBB in October, which, thank you, which allowed us to raise money. I am excited to announce, after hours and hours and weekends and nights and holidays and all of this for the last 2 years, that we are about to do a first close next Friday for my fundraising round, which is not a small feat for this, capital landscape, and also 2 minority women. So I'm very proud of what we've done. And today what I'm going to show you guys is how. So when Neil, and I did talk to Neil as to who is in the audience, what would you guys want to hear, number one. But then also number two, you guys are going to chat GPT what is required in a pitch deck anyway. So I'm not going to tell you anything you guys can get in 5 seconds. What I want to tell you is how I've been able to raise, me and my team have been able to raise money, the do's and don'ts, and I'm going to do it against the pitch deck that I just pitched last week in Pittsburgh. So I want to be able to show you guys what's working out there in the market right now, and then take that, and obviously the good thing is I think most of what I'm going to show you is within that 7-minute mark anyways. So expect the length that I'm going to show you to match what you need for BYOBB, but also I don't have a finance slide in here. So know that, there's a little bit of give and take there. Okay? Does that work for today? Okay. And then at the end of it, if you guys want me to just like pitch you guys, the company as a whole, I'll do that. Okay. Okay. So firstly, I know, and I think when I talked to Neil, it was ed tech, education tech, wellness, and some other more tech-based companies in the room. What I want you guys to take out of this is, yes, mine and BYOBB is a synthetic cornea company. So it's a medical device company that has a really strict regulatory pathway to get to market. It's going to be different, and it's not going to be directly applicable. So what I want you guys to take away, and I've attempted in my do's and don'ts kind of message, is to bring it up a level. Not focus on the product itself, but focus on the pitch. And how do you connect with your audience? Okay. So first thing here, you guys saw my cover slide. So you're going to be nervous. And by the way, I was nervous about 10 minutes ago. Okay. I am nervous every single time I'm in front of people. But this is your introduction. This is your first handshake. This is your first impression of yourself, of your company, of your brand. So make sure that you have something that they're going to remember. Come up with that one catchy line, right? In our case, it's illuminating the path to clear vision. And when I say that, you have to have that energy, have that oomph. Because if you don't believe it, why would the judges believe it? Or why would anybody that you're talking to believe it? Okay. Believe in yourself, right? You're up here for a reason. You've gone through the rigor of BYOBB's process, meaning applications, hundreds and hundreds of applications have gone in. Make sure that you believe in it wholeheartedly, just like if you were selected, that whoever selected you believes in you. And then most importantly, don't freaking forget to breathe, okay? Like it's especially when you're up here and you're so anxious and you're so tight, just release for a moment before you start. Make sure you don't forget to breathe. So the don'ts. Don't be up here looking at note cards, okay? It's a 7-minute pitch. You have to remember what you're going to say. And for me, it's always remember the first and remember the bookends of the pitch. Because you're going to practice so much that you want to make sure that you remember exactly how you're going to deliver the first line and exactly how you're going to close your story. So don't be looking at note cards, memorize your stuff. Don't look down, make your eye contact. If you're comfortable, move around a little bit, right? And I know the stage you'll have, and I assume it'll be on pedestal again. Like you'll have the room to move around. So get comfortable with being up here. And then again, don't forget to breathe, okay? So this is my second slide, and this is where I go into a bit of the storytelling. Corneal blindness, if you talk about, not being able to see, it doesn't apply to most people. It's not a contagious disease. It doesn't make headlines. It's not cancer. It's not things that, is going to be astronomically amazing in terms of the medical field. But you need to be able to talk to whoever you're talking to and relate to them and have them to be able to describe, in my case, the patient's pain. It's not daily pain, it's hourly pain. It's every second of their day. And you want to be able to make sure that you address this problem very clearly, even if the person sitting next to you has no idea what corneal disease is, okay? So tell a story, find that connective tissue between what you're presenting in your product and what you're offering to anybody. And I have 2 boys, you know, 8 and 10. And a lot of times I end up practicing in front of them because if they don't make sense, if they don't understand what I'm saying and I can't connect with them or someone who is under 10 years of age, then I've lost the audience, okay? Be authentic. This really is where your storytelling and your authenticity and really your energy and why this matters to you comes out. The problem statement usually is the first in a pitch deck, right? Which is what I'm presenting here. But allow them to see you as a person and that connective tissue between yourself and whoever you're trying to pitch. So one mistake that I've seen in a lot of pitches, and when I say a lot of pitches, I think in the past 2 years, I think I must have seen about 200 or so, if not more. Whether I'm sitting in the audience or whether I'm the one pitching and it's just like startup days and all of these accelerators and et cetera, right? I've seen the worst ones where they address the problem and they're like, this is cancer, you know, this is how, you know, how much it affects it. And they'll put like a medical diagram up there. And I'm an engineer, you know, and I'm surrounded, especially in my time at J&J, I'm surrounded by that kind of science. But even that was just like, I don't know what you're talking about. So make sure that you are not too technical, and then also be human. Don't be a robot, right? Find that connective tissue. And then just dumb it down. Like I said, like translate this to elementary school kind of message so that it's very clearly understood, because I know some of your companies are going to be difficult and that's what you should be proud of. But know that this person that you're talking to is not going to know your company like you do. So you have to dumb it down. Okay. This is my next slide where I'm really saying, all right, I just told you about what a patient's journeys looks like. Now I'm going to double down and make sure you know how big this problem is. 13 million people around the globe can't see today because they're waiting for somebody to pass for them to see again. How ridiculous is that? And then on top of that, of those 13 million, only 1%, 1 in 70 patients actually gets access to a solution. This is ridiculous. This is not healthcare. This is insanity. And then on top of that, there are patients around the globe that because of their cultures and their communities and their beliefs, they don't take donated tissue. So essentially what we're saying here is they can't see for the rest of their lives. That's unacceptable. So what I'm showing here is you created that connective tissue, you've described the problem. Now remind them and tell them how big this problem is. Double down on 3 things to make sure that they remember how big this problem is. Put it down and put in the numbers and reflect that, you know, so they're reminded. But don't get too detailed here. It's the big ones. You know, we know that if as entrepreneurs, there's big problems to solve. And with big problems comes a lot of things to fix. But prioritize that list and pick the top 3. So there's a signal here that I want you guys to remember. People, and this is actually at a dear friend of ours, a team member of mine, Jake Voorhees, an incredible connector, someone that I keep very close to me on purpose. But he's taught me it all comes in 3s. If you go by 3, you will always, the person in the memory will always remember by 3. Any more than that, they're going to forget. Any less, doesn't matter. Go at 3, okay? Now that I've described the problem, now I'm going to describe my moat. Why us? Why my product? Why does this matter? And I'm going to be bold about it. And the way that I'm being bold about it is most of these people don't know cornea issues, right? But what they do know is cataracts. They do know that their elderly or their parents or their grandparents are dealing with issues due to cataracts. So what I say is I'm the generational leap. I meet them where they are and what they understand. And compared to cataracts, I'm going to do that for cornea. Because if you look at the cataract space, the market is insane. But there is no innovation in the front of the eye. So I specifically call that out. And then I say, well, what also makes us special compared to donated tissue is I'm doing 2 things. Something that donated tissue can never do. I am restoring and correcting vision. So what I'm saying is this patient's going to go from completely blind to near 20/20 vision in an hour and a half. That's my moat. So describe your moat so that you can be the GOAT, okay? I know that sounds cheesy, but whatever. So, and the difference is this is the product. This is your bread and butter. This is what you think is going to make you successful. So spend the time here to really make sure that whoever you're talking to knows that. And again, less is more here. You know, again, it's a big problem, but try to simplify as much as you can to the 1 or 2 or 3 points that you know they're going to remember. And, you know, the don'ts is don't go weak, you know, demand the attention that this product deserves. And then lastly, you know, don't go into too much detail. You can see the common denominator here, but just try to simplify the messaging, because the audience is not going to remember the umpteen details that we know as the owners or as the entrepreneurs. They don't need to know, because at the end of the day, you're pitching to get a meeting. You're not pitching to get money. Okay, keep that in mind. You're pitching to get another conversation, because there is never a time, unless you're on Shark Tank, and even that you still have due diligence to go after. But there's never a time where they're going to be like, oh my God, that was amazing. Here's $1 million. Never, ever happens, okay? I've been now 4 years, 4 years in this game. Never happened. So don't count on that. Count on trying to get the next 30 minutes with this person one-on-one is what you're pitching for. Now, competition. Okay, so what I'm presenting here, and you know, and we intentionally chose this because even though there is limited innovation, there is still competition. We do know that, you know, I'm not going to go up here and say, I'm the best, I'm the only, and I am going to blow this out of the water. That's not realistic. There is always competition, direct or indirect competition. The indirect could be, well, there could be a gene therapy that's going to solve my corneal blindness problem that will essentially take me out of business, right? So you have to think about it as that not that there is no competition, but that there is competition, and this is what differentiates us. So tell that story. So in our case, it's, yeah, there's 2 in the clinic right now. They're way ahead of us. But you know what? What's great about it? It's not going well. And we're able to learn from what they've done wrong so that we can be better. And we don't need to waste all of that money that they've wasted. And then therefore we can be a more efficient investor with your capital. Okay, so that's how I tell the story here. So the do's, list the big ones, keep it simple. Focus on the value propositions that's really going to make you be the moat and make your product be the differentiator. Also, be honest. I think there's a lot of people out there that are like, there's no competition. I'm the only one. I can't, you know, I'm the best. But then also, if you do know there's a competition and you don't bring it up, during due diligence, they're going to find it. Just so you know. And due diligence, I just went through with 2, takes anywhere from 2 months, 6 to 10 weeks is typical. They dig everything. So if you don't announce it now and they find it later, it hurts your credibility. Okay, and this is further down. I know you know, you guys aren't pitching to VCs right now, but I'm just giving you guys a download of how it goes. So be honest and show how your product differentiates. The don'ts up there are actually direct feedback from a few investors I've talked to. And it's almost like a pet peeve. So you guys have seen the quadrant diagram with the competition slide where, you know, I think it's, I forget the X and Y axis, but it's like, I'm the only one that's up here and I'm on this island by myself and therefore I'm great and believe in me. Pet peeve. Investors hate that because again, there is competition, direct or indirect. So do not do the quadrant, please, I beg you. Countless investors have told me, like, whenever that slide comes up, I don't even know what I'm looking at. So be honest and show how you differentiate. Don't use the quadrant, okay?
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you go back to your benefits comparison? So I think the other piece, and we've mentioned this before, but just I think it's worth reiterating. Another opportunity that this slide presents is an opportunity for you to tell your story a little bit through what those competitors are doing, and also maybe help explain a little bit more about who your company is and what they're doing by providing an example that maybe more people are familiar with. And so if you are, again, very specialized and it's really hard to kind of explain, if you're able to say, okay, well, here's this bigger, broader company, an Amazon, a Netflix, a whatever, that more people understand, and you can show, again, where maybe they, yes, check some of those boxes, but where they don't, it's another opportunity for you to pull people in and give them a little bit more about your company. So I just always think this is a great opportunity, not just, again, to show how you set yourself apart, but to, again, frame kind of where your company is in all that.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Jimmy. Okay. All right. So then becomes the market opportunity, right? So we've talked about the problem, we've talked about our moat, and now investors and people want to know, well, how big is this problem? How truly big is it? And in our case, you know, because of that 13 million patients on the donor cornea waiting list, I've priced my unit to accommodate for, you know, underdeveloped countries that can't afford the price point that I can, you know, potentially go and develop. So I've priced it at $1,000, which therefore gives me $13 billion TAM, which essentially is your total addressable market. And I, as an engineer, you know, I am very conservative, and I also love data, unfortunately, fortunately. With that data means I know my assumptions that go into each one of these lines. A lot of people, what they do is, I think I'm at a 13 trillion, 13 gazillion dollar, whatever, right? Don't do that, okay? People are gonna see right through that. So be realistic on the data, okay? Because again, in due diligence, they're gonna poke holes. And I had my investor look at my entire disease, the way that I built my forecast and how I got to my sum to the nth degree. Go ahead. No? Oh, okay, go ahead. Mm-hmm. So it's
can you just repeat the question? Just so
so what is considered, you know, how do you not say I'm going to boil the entire, or I'm going to do the entire world, right? Like, how do you look at it from a more micro level? And fundamentally, it comes down to research and the assumptions that you're making. If you can back your assumptions and you can do the world, then do the world. But it has to come down to credible assumptions and the logic bridge that got you from A to B. If you can explain that, more power to you, man. I need your autograph, because at that point you're going to be incredible.
But shameless plug for BYOBB workshop number 2, which was all about market opportunity in the competitive landscape. Adam from the library came and showed us a bunch of tools that are available to help you figure out how to tell that story through data. You know, everything that you could use to help you build that case, you hopefully have access to through that system. So go back and watch that recording if you haven't.
Yeah, I mean, this slide, just for context, took me and Amelia 2 to 3 years to get right. Okay, so it's not something that you can just get right in a week, and it's constantly iterating. And what we realized is, like, you know, yeah, market is important. And yes, how we tell the story on the market is also equally as important. Okay, but great question. So again, comes down to data. There is flexibility, however, in the TAM, the broader world kind of view, right? Because what really they're going to be looking at, TAM, SAM, SUM, is your obtainable market. What is really that you think with your moat and with the problem that you're solving, what is that true slice of the pie that you're going to go after? And in some instances, it's called your beachhead market. Like, where is the exact pinpointed area that you're going to go after first? But ultimately, yeah, the world is a lot bigger, you know, and that's where that TAM has a little bit more flexibility, as long as you can make those assumptions and provide that. Okay. Just don't make stuff up. I don't know how much more to say it. Just don't make it up. Okay. All right. So then, you know, and this is very important from an investor's perspective, because they need to know what their investment dollars are getting them. What are they buying and when are they getting their return? So this slide is very intentional to describe that. BioLattice is a very technical, deep technical milestone-based company, where I know step by step on what needs to get done. So in my case, I can lay it out this simply, if you want to call it, but it was a 50-page Gantt chart that I essentially boiled up into how many triangles? 5. As to the critical milestones and the inflection points that's going to make the difference. So I'm sure you guys are going to have a lot of things, you know, that you have to do to get from A to B. We all know that. But try to pinpoint the ones that are critical, that is going to, oh my God, that was a big deal. Oh my goodness, that's going to make even more of a bigger deal. You know, like you have to go off of that and choose those to reflect. Okay. Yeah, so with that said, you know, try to, and timeline slides, I've seen the whole gamut where people literally put their 50-line Gantt chart on a slide, and I'm like, you know, I can barely see the heading, let alone any of those 50 lines. So make sure that, yes, there's a lot of detail, don't put that up there. Don't put a 50, you know, line Gantt chart up there. And then show best case, never show worst case, because things are always going to go wrong. And what I mean by best case is all of the bottom here where I've got how much I need to raise to get to my final inflection point, there's contingency built in there, okay? So never come in and say, I'm gonna hit this on this date exactly the way it's going to be, because things are always gonna go wrong. So always put, did I say best case? Show, don't, sorry, because it says don't show best case, always show worst case, okay, is what I'm trying to show there. So this is where the traction slide comes in, and this is where, with all the things that you've told the audience, this is the problem, this is how I'm gonna solve the problem, this is how big of a problem it is, this is what we've done so far, okay? And in our case, you know, we've raised a considerable amount of money with all of these partnerships, you know, listed below. We won Startup of the Year last year in Philly, which was super amazing. And then we also have protected our moat through filing IP. So what you hear from a lot of these folks is, sure, you know, firstly, you're not going to say that you don't have competition. You are going to say that you have competition, number one. What they're also going to ask you, well, how are you going to protect yourself from somebody else stealing your idea? Well, what I've done and I've seen worked is I name drop. I name drop my legal counsel. Firstly, because we pay a pretty penny to make sure that we are protecting our moat with my legal counsel, but it's important for them to know that you are using a credible source to protect your IP. So when you guys get there, you know, make sure that you name drop you know, that counsel. Then, you know, I'm very intentional in showing that we're not doing this alone. You know, and in our case, we have to raise venture money to get to, you know, that final inflection point. So what ends up happening, and what's interesting here, is investors are like, oh, I know them. Oh, I know them. Oh, I like them. Oh, okay. Then it like creates this kind of effect, right? So number one, from a traction standpoint, be excited about where you are. You've done a lot, and show that energy when you get to this slide, because if you're not excited about it, why would anybody else be excited about it, okay? Name drop, like I said, and then talk about what's next. So what I don't have on here is like, you know, I have a hint at it at the lead investor is secured, but be excited about what's coming in the future. Don't just talk about what's in the past. And then what you don't do is, you know, not everything and anything, all the little awards, all the little successes, just focus on the big things. And then do your homework. So I've actually done, I've changed this slide quite a bit. So this picture here, I changed for a pitch about a month ago, because I knew that that woman with glasses was going to be in the room. And I was like, I got to make sure that she gets a call out, you know, and she's a current investor through SOSV. I was like, I know Sabria's going to be in the room. I got to change this slide to match who I'm trying to appease in that room. Okay. So then our team, and, you know, this is really where show them off, you know, and you can't do this alone. You have to do this with the team. And, you know, I've learned that in my time, either, you know, at the union facility trying to fix a boiler, you know, in the middle of the night, or or at the accelerator organization at Johnson & Johnson, where I was surrounding myself with all of these medical doctors and PhDs. I can't do this alone. And what's special about this is, in a company that you own, you better not be doing it alone. You need to surround yourself with the smartest people. If you are the smartest one in the room, you've messed up. You need to be surrounding yourself with people who are so much more smarter than you, so that you guys can accomplish your goal together. And in my case, Dr. Amelia Zellander and Dr. Kyle Webb, two of the most brilliant scientists that I know, that are going to be the people that are going to bring this technology to life. I'm useless in the lab. I'm a chemical engineer with an MBA, I can talk, right? And I can try to raise money, which, successfully we've done. But I am useless in terms of the bread and butter. So therefore, I need a team that can complement and help, right, bring this product to life. So show off your team. Number one, pick a team. Don't do this alone. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Yep. Solo founders, unless you have a team. So that's the differentiator, right? And in my case, an investor wouldn't come in unless we were co-founders. Because if you think about this, right, like as big of a problem that you're looking to solve, and then if you're going to say, I'm going to do it alone, what if you get a cold? What if you get the flu? Who's going to pick up when you can't physically be there, or you just don't have the energy? You need a partner to be able to help you when you're going to do something as big as you're going to do.
And I would say, just for the purposes of the BYOBB, if you are a solo entrepreneur and you are just starting out, totally great, love that. Include some folks that have advised you or guided you along the way and their expertise. Maybe it was a professor that kind of encouraged you to submit or to enter the competition to begin with, put their title and their bona fides underneath. If there was somebody that really helped you with the presentation or kind of getting ready, put them as an advisor. That's a totally appropriate thing to do for the purposes of the BYOBB submission.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think I've seen Alan's face and Carl's face on
yes.
certain pitch decks, which I was like, that's awesome. So yeah, so make sure, I wouldn't just put your face, I think is what Neil's point is, like try to fill out the team, even if it's at an advising capacity. Okay.
Is there another question? Yeah. Yep. So the question was the traction slide. Is that something that's required for the BYOBB? If you're in the early stages, what does that look like? It's not required because, again, we know that some of these ideas that are submissions that have been put forth have not launched yet. And so to show traction maybe doesn't make sense at that point. So it is not required. I'll just say that as kind of the short answer. I think if you wanted to and kind of project or put some of that in there, you are welcome to do that. I think the two slide deck option or examples that we give in the resource folder, one of them includes it and one of them doesn't. And again, those are both excellent examples that were picked out. So hang on, if you're going to add something, you're going to need to talk in the microphone.
My recommendation would be, no matter where you are, show some traction. Just having been in judges' discussions and reviewers' discussions, because otherwise, as fact-based as everything you have here, it still leaves reason for doubt. And typically, even if it's doing initial interviews or building some type of MVP or doing anything, it shows you're more serious and it shows it's not just a pipe dream.
Yeah, and it could be as simple as like, I talked to this customer and they validated, or I talked to 5 customers and they said this is a problem. Like it could be that simple. Just that you've done your homework to validate this problem that you're looking to fix. Okay. Yeah, so this one is important because it's, don't let whoever you're talking to, in my case, most of my cases, investors, don't let them question that this is not the right team. Even in our case, we are still fairly early, right? And they're taking a big risk on us. But what they're also doubling down on is, are we the right people to be able to pull something as big as this off? And if they don't agree with that, they're not going to invest no matter how good the product is. So it comes down to the people and the team. When you are looking to raise funding, they're looking at the people first and the team first. Okay. So I end with an ask. This is my final slide. I'm raising $2.5 million in a seed round, and in my case, it's a preferred stock seed round, which means equity is being given out in this round. And then I say, and with that money, we will, as a team, we as a partner now, if you're going to invest, will be able to get to an FDA milestone, which essentially allows me to start my clinical trials in humans. So one of the things that I've seen is, some people forget this slide. At the end of telling a story, even if it's BYOBB or in any kind of setting, and I think I actually forgot it once too, I just completely forgot it. And then it's like you present this problem, you've got the moat, and then you've got the team, and then it's like, thank you, goodbye. You don't want to do that. Even if it's asking for, I need help finding a person, or I need help. I think in my case, one of them I asked, I would love to find a co-founder. Or is there anybody in my space that that could help mentor me or coach me? Have an ask. It doesn't need to be financial. It could really be anything that you need at that moment in time, because you don't know who's in the audience. And if somebody's like, oh, I know someone who, is an ophthalmologist, I'd love to introduce you, or I'm an ophthalmologist. Like, you don't know who you're talking to. So always have an ask situation.
And just for the purposes of the BYOBB, yes, please include an ask slide, a ballpark good figure if you kind of don't know what to ask for, or you're kind of not at that stage. The grand prize winner this year, somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000, so $50,000. What would you do with that? If you have greater aspirations and you want to ask for more, that is totally acceptable. I would say that. If you're going to go way over that, I will let you kind of decide what way over that means. Come talk to me and we can maybe figure out what a good kind of ending slide might be. Because you are presenting to the judges. The judges are going to be sitting right over there by that plant. So they are going to be the ones that they are not taking out their checkbooks and writing you money, but they are ones kind of responsible for deciding who gets the grand prize. So you can direct it towards them. There are probably going to be other investors, representatives of VC firms, other people, like Linda said, that might just be interested in joining your board if you ever have a board one day. Or, hey, my cousin's best friend is an excellent coder, and it sounds like you need some help with coding. Let me introduce the two of you. And so there should be an ask in here, even if, again, this is for a pitch competition and we are not expecting for you to be making a pitch directly to quote unquote investors, because it's to the judges, but still kind of follow this same format. That makes sense? Okay.
And then I end with this. It goes back right up to the beginning, right? And I remind them what our mission is. And our mission is to allow patients to see clearly again, right? So it's pretty much the same thing in terms of believe in yourself. Don't forget to breathe. You finally got to this point. But then also don't forget to thank them, right? I think like a lot of people in the rooms that you're going to be in, even the organizers of the pitch competitions, I'm looking at Neil in particular, and Alan and Carl, right? It took a lot for that moment for you to get a 7-minute pitch. So if nothing else, thank the organizers, thank the, obviously don't do like a award ceremony thank you list, but just make sure that you say thank you, because it really took a lot to get to that moment. I know it's a lot, it's very stressful for you yourself to pitch, but don't forget it took a lot to get to that moment. Okay. Mm-hmm.
But we are supposed to be the first people here.
Correct.
But like every startup is not gonna, most likely not gonna make profit in the first year.
So let me make sure I'm understanding the question. So the question is, for the purposes of the BYOBB, the shouldn't say only, the requirement that we have of you is that you submit a 3-year financial model. I think I said this in the last time. If you wanted to go above that, you're more than welcome to go above if you feel like you can project further out. But the minimum we want is for 3 years. And so I think your question is, how do you show that in terms of what? Sure. So in the first year, it's more you are more likely to be losing money in the first year. And so yes, I think it's okay to share that. So when you're, I guess I don't understand the question.
but that's.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. So the question is, if you're gonna if you project that you're gonna lose 60,000 in your first year, is it okay to show that for this competition? Yes. I would counter that, right? That at some point, the hope is that this idea, this whatever, is going to make money, and so yes, be sure to show that too. Does that answer your question? Right. Yes. Be realistic.
Each of you.
Linda, you probably speak more. You lose a lot more. Really? You want me to eat it? I'm always told I have a big mouth. Now he wants me to be bigger. If you don't show losses, you'll lose credibility right off the block. I mean, you know, and
Yep.
Linda, especially with a technical medical thing, you're going to be losing money for what, 5, 6, 7 years?
3, but yes.
Okay. He is that good, by the way. The other thing I would say, and I'll play counter to Neil, but Linda, you should talk. Anything more than 3-year financial projections in this day and age, I would argue is total BS. So I would actually not go beyond 3, but Linda, what's your experience?
Agreed. I mean, investors are asking for 5, but that's, you know, that's just at our stage now, but 3 is more realistic. I mean, and the basis is like, try to get your first year as accurately represented as possible. Second, just a hair more. Third is kind of a stretch, even in a 3-year projection, you know. Try to get your first year right, as accurate as you can. Yes, because then it comes down to, it's a build stage, right? You're going to be losing to build. That's just how a business works. So you are going to be in the red. But what you're going to show is upon that build in year 2 or year 3, this is how the trajectory goes. And based on my customer validation, based on that I'm really solving the right problem, based on my conversations with potential interests, this is what I'm seeing. But you have to, again, back it up with, you know, back up those assumptions. Okay. So I'm going to leave you with 3. Yeah, the 3s. Make sure that you are able to describe why you and why your team. It is going to come down to the people first, especially at the stages that we're at. As early as we are, it is a big bet for whoever is placing the bet on you. So they have to bet on you as an individual and your team, or whoever is supporting you. Why is this a big deal right now? Why is this such a big problem? There's 1,000 things that's going on that could have, you know, a solution for. Why this one? Why should I care? And then lastly, why is this the right product or the solution to solve that big problem? So I know that there's a lot of slides that you guys need to build, but make sure that you answer these 3 key questions, okay? And then practice. Okay, don't go up here with no cards, you know, not memorizing. I'll never forget at BYOBB when I was up here, I brought my entire family, my 2 boys, and you know, and I think I told you guys I memorized the front and the bottom, and my youngest was like falling off that ledge over there, and I freaked out. I blacked out. I was like, oh. And I literally had to say, "Can I start over?" And it was terrible, but you know, I'll never forget that moment. And it was mostly, actually, I didn't practice as much as I could have, because I had already pitched twice on this stage, not too far, you know, before BYOBB. So I was like, I got it. I didn't. So make sure that you practice. And our accelerator that we went through one of our investors actually had a great suggestion. Practice backwards. Firstly, this tech thing may not work. So what if you don't have your slides up there? What are you going to do for 7 minutes? You don't want to miss that opportunity to not be able to tell your story and tell your why and why this product is great. So not only do you have to memorize everything, but one good way is, like, if you can practice and memorize from the bottom all the way to the top, do the entire pitch backwards without slides, you're golden. You're good. You know your stuff. Okay? And then just breathe. Please don't forget to breathe. You're going to get nervous up here. It's going to be intense. But, you know, get up here, calm yourself, take a breath, and then go. Okay? And at the end, realize what just happened and be like, that was awesome. And then go. Okay?
But stay on the stage for 3 minutes of questions from the judge.
Stay on stage for 3 minutes of grilling, which, you know, but you know your stuff, you've done your work, you've done your practice, you know your stuff. They're not going to know your product better than you, just like any job interview. You know yourself better than anybody else who's talking to you. So make sure they know that. Okay. That's it. Thank you, thank you.
What other questions do we have for Linda? Nothing? You're good. No, this is great. So the question was, how is it weighted of content of your presentation versus your ability to deliver it? I would say the most important thing is that the judges see that work has been put into your slides and your overall presentation. If you go up there and you are the most amazing speaker, you know, could command a room, and you are so vibrant and energetic, and you've got jokes and they're eating out of the palm of your hand, but you've got a white background with black bullet points and miles of text, you're going to be scored the same as if somebody has no charisma and whispers and has microphone problems, but has a slide deck that is out of this world. And so I think that I hate to kind of pop out and not really give an answer, but it really is the whole package. And so I think the judges also, I should say, the judges in the past have shown an ability to say, okay, they tripped on their walk up the stairs and that threw them off, and it took them a minute or two to get going. We are not going to hold those first couple of slides against them as they literally got their feet back under them, or you know, somebody's cell phone went off in the middle of it and it really threw them off. That is, you know, something that happens, and we're just that we're not going to hold that against them. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Yeah, question in the back. So the question was, as you're projecting your financials, how modest, how conservative should you be? Do you put kind of tiers on there of, hey, here's the most aggressive, here's a middle tier, here's the least aggressive? I guess, Linda, if you have, I'm happy to share with the BYOBB, but I think it'd be helpful to hear kind of your experience when you are projecting that out.
Yeah, you know, there's always going to be an upper and lower limit. And again, this is kind of the engineer that comes out of me, but like, you know, it's always going to be, everything's going to work out great, and this is my upper range. Everything's going to suck. This is my lower range, right? And and in some instances, I've communicated that, but this is the swing, but this is where I'm going to be in the middle, and this is how I'm going to do it. So, you know, there is instances where if you have the time, right, and also most likely this is a second conversation with whoever you're talking to, kind of detail, right? But if you want, you can show the upper and lower limit and then how you're going to hit that middle threshold. Okay.
I would say for the purposes of the BYOBB, I think both in the online portal submission, where hopefully the reviewer has dedicated a good chunk of time to sit down and review this and review it thoughtfully, and also in the 7-minute pitch where time is very valuable. I think you want to treat time and the attention of either the reviewer or the judges as a resource. And so if you truly feel that the best way to tell your story from a financial perspective is to show an upper, a middle, and a lower tier, And that really, you think, paints the best picture of kind of where your company, where your idea is going to go. I am not going to discourage you from doing that. I would encourage you to think about, you've got 7 minutes when it comes time for the finalist presentation of the judge's time, and do you want to spend twice as long on a financial slide or 3 times as long on a financial slide going over that stuff, whereas you could be using that time more effectively to tell your story. Same with the written, the online submission, and kind of the attention that the reviewer is giving to that slide, right? They again have carved out some time. They've got focus. They're reviewing a couple of these, and so do you want to have them try and digest that? Again, if you truly think that it makes sense and it paints the best picture, I think I would always encourage you to find that middle. I think people also know, right? Like, these estimates are conservative. These estimates are somewhere in the right. Just because you say, $60,000 loss in the first year, if you come back and it's, hey, it's actually 65. All right, well, we're done. We're out. Like, how dare you go $5,000 over what you said? I think there's some grace that's offered there. We know this is not an exact science, and so I would find a way to be able to come up with a number that makes you feel good while also being accurate.
And the title slide is projections.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's a projection.
Yeah. Other question? Yeah.
So the question was, with not going too technical in the material that we are presenting, but we also do have a lot of numbers. How do you justify that, and how do you build that credibility with whoever you're talking to? In our case, investors, right? So what I have, and I didn't necessarily put in this slide, is when it comes to, when I say don't get too technical, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and describe to them how this thing is made. Just like you wouldn't sit there and describe to them all of your code if it's a tech product. But what you're going to describe to them is what I've built. And in my case, the way that I sometimes had to describe this product, it's a fancy contact lens that gets permanently implanted into your eye. I'm not going to tell them how it gets implanted. I have another slide that I left off that does go into a little bit more technical detail. But again, remember, you're trying to communicate to someone who knows nothing about your business and will not know to that level of technical rigor that you know. So what's important here is you communicate that you know what you're talking about, that you have stuff to back that up. And if they want to look under the hood, I'll show you everything. But for the purposes of BYOBB and pitching, keep it as high level as you can, but still make sure, like I said, describe your moat. Make sure that you've picked the 3 things that is very special about your product. Okay.
And I think another way to answer that is, I think you want to get technical enough, I think Linda said this, to generate interest in having a second meeting with you. Oh, that embedded contact lens sounds really great. That sounds like it could be revolutionary, and there's a market for it. And I, as an investor, that is something that appeals to me. I would love to sit down with Linda for an hour in a conference room and really have her go over, and maybe bring in my chief technology officer as a consultant or as somebody else that can vet this a little bit more. So again, for the purposes of the BYOBB, yes, please do not get too technical. Please keep it kind of broad strokes. Explain what you are doing, explain it in a way that hopefully people understand. And then, hopefully there are people that will be in this room that will want to hear more about it for that second follow-up presentation or second follow-up conversation.
Because the investor, even in my cases, had to bring an ophthalmologist with them. Even, and they were like, I don't know this space well, but I know that it could be disruptive. I'm going to go into my network of experts so that they can tell me if this is real. So it's not going to be in a pitch setting. It's going to be after. So all of the things that Neil just described have happened. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to this slide because I really like that. Mhm. Mhm. Is the business model required?
The business model is not, I don't think it's a quote unquote requirement. I think it's strongly recommended that you at least address it in the so the question was about if you so this is a business to customer model. If you are not sure if you were going to do business to customer or business to business, or maybe you're going to start out as business to customer and then transition over. Again, I think for the purposes of the BYOBB, sharing your story and saying, as we sit here right now on April 15th, as I'm giving this presentation to you all, or on March 11th, as I am submitting this document, I see that this company is a business to customer model for the first 2 years until we get into a school system or until we get into a whatever, and then maybe we become business to business model. I think that's a totally appropriate thing to share. Again, that kind of falls under the projection piece of it. And you are envisioning where your company is going to go.
And the business model is constantly going to evolve. It's not a, and you guys know this, right? Like all the other successful businesses didn't start off that way. They got there by learning. And I think that's one thing as startups and entrepreneurs is don't ever write anything in pen. Everything constantly changes, constantly. And that's okay. That's the whole process of doing something that's incredibly innovative. There is no playbook to it. We're literally writing as we go. Okay.
Any other questions? Linda and Alan and I will hang around for a little bit if you do want to come up individually, but for now, let's give one more round of applause to Linda. And I think I'm going to wrap us up. Again, please be aware of the upcoming deadlines. Again, for those of you that are current students, know that spring break is coming up, so please utilize that time wisely. Reach out to us if you have any questions, want to talk about anything you saw in this presentation or any of the other ones leading up to it. Again, more info to come hopefully next week about the expert mentoring session on the 9th and 10th before the due date. But thank you all for being here in person, much appreciated. Thank you all for those of you watching on YouTube. And yeah, have a great night and let us know if you need anything. Thanks, everybody.